At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
Eric, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Doug.
Hey, I'm really excited about this conversation. It's fascinating to me when we start talking about personalities and how understanding that can have such an effect in people's lives. But what I'd love for you, your background has nothing to do with personalities. And so I'd love for you to share with the audience kind of who you are and, what you actually do, and then how on earth did you get involved with looking at personalities and writing the book?
It's interesting because the way I got involved with personality types is more of on a personal level. Like it was something I always felt kind of weird when I was younger, and not weird in a bad way, but different, right? And so when you feel a little different, then you kind of try to figure out why. And so I studied it on a personal level. On a professional level, I started my own education company, and then I started to see that there were ways where I could use the personality typing to teach my teachers how to understand their own bias better, so that they can start understanding their students and understanding like how they might have a different value system than the students they're teaching, and not to necessarily push that value system on their students, right? And so I integrated for a decade into my own education company, and that's where I did the research for the book. And yeah, I started writing the book, and that's I was able to publish that this year.
So, education company, what is that
Mhm.
exactly, and what do you do?
It was basically tutoring in the home. So we provided in-home tutoring for about 1,000 students a year. Mainly, it was students who were of need, generally in the local school districts. So we worked with maybe 40 or 50 school districts a year in the Southern California area. And it would be one-on-one tutoring. So my teachers would have no excuse in terms of being able to adjust the lesson for each individual student, right? It wasn't like they were teaching a whole classroom of kids. And for me, it was more or less a way of connecting with the students. So it's not just about teaching them math or English language arts, right? It's about teaching them how to like grow as an individual, because all these students had separate issues that were not necessarily academic.
Right, right. Oh, that's wonderful, and obviously you've incorporated the personality part of it. So your book, talk a little bit about your book. What's the name of it, and why write it?
The funny thing is that this might be a longer story than it needs to be, but I actually went back to screenwriting after I started my education company, and I kind of stopped doing that because I wanted to try something different, even though screenwriting was my academic background. And I was writing these pilots, and I go to bars after writing with my friends, and we start talking about personality types, right? And I was like, oh, well, like I used to own an education company, and I had my own personality typing methodology. And it just started a conversation where people are like, hey, instead of writing scripts, you should really write a book on that. And I was like, no, I'm just going to keep writing my pilots. And one of my friends actually put the personality types in the show she was working on. And then at that point, I was like, okay, well, I guess if you're going to put it in your show and it seems palatable for a public audience, then maybe I should write a book on it. And it took me a few months, and that's when I came out with it. And it's basically my own personality typing methodology. It's called The Power of Personality. And by reading it, it should teach people how to type the people around them, including themselves.
All right, and my introduction to personality was when I was living in Boise. Actually, I was part of a networking group, and they invited a fellow to come in, and he talked about personalities, and I was just fascinated by it. And at the time, I had four children, but
Mm.
two of my boys were not getting along. They were in high school, a couple of years apart, and they were not getting along. And so I thought, I wonder if this would help. And so I actually had him work with both my boys, and it was amazing the change that took place. And even today, where they're in their 30s, it's interesting to see how they have used that in their lives and choosing their careers and all of those type of things. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what's the important. We're going to talk about your methodology in a bit, but why is understanding personality so important?
I think it's because our personalities really dictate some of our core values of what we want, right? And I think sometimes there is a tendency for the majority of people, because a majority of people kind of fit into a certain personality category, and there's a tendency for them to kind of push that value system on the minority of people, right? And I think, you have kids who grow up and thinking, oh, I should value these things, even though I actually value these things. And then it's that push and pull, right? And if you start trying to pursue things that you don't really match with your own values, then that's only going to lead to unhappiness, right? And it's also only going to lead to personal conflict. I think when we understand our personality type, we get a core idea of who we are. It's like kind of like developing an anchor. And once you have that anchor, then you're kind of like safer to kind of explore the different people around you. But I think there's a danger when you don't truly understand yourself to like kind of try to assimilate into places that don't really fit you.
Well, and even understanding others. And that was a challenge.
Hmm.
That was a challenge with my boys. Is one was a specific personality, the other one was kind of the opposite. And
Mm.
so, one tended to take things very specially and emotionally, and the other one just rah, rah. And so it was really interesting to see how that worked, but to see them understand that and make that change. So let's talk about your methodology. Let's talk about the personality. How did you come up with that? Because as you know, there are so many different types of personality profiling. And quite frankly, as I listened to this, first fellow, I thought, wow, this is really great. And then as I got involved in some others, I realized, some of these, and it was kind of at the time something really big to have that personality profile. And some of them just sucked. They just did not make sense.
Right. They tend to be I find that they tend to sometimes overcomplicate things and try to make it more like based on terminology or like too specific. And then you just get into the weeds, right? Where you're just like, oh, this is just an exercise in intellectual theorizing versus actual practical. Like I see people like this, I see patterns of behavior, I see these things working and kind of adjusting from that. Um, but yeah, mine came about based on goals and desires, right? I think a lot of them tend to focus on traits that we see on the outside. But for me, it was more like working with students. I tend to see like two kids could go for the same things and appear similar on the outside, but when you ask them certain questions, their desire is different. Like I always say, like you can have four writers who love to write and are really into writing, but write for totally different reasons. The reasons why Tolstoy might write a novel might be different, or not might. They're very different than the reasons why Hemingway
Yeah.
might write a novel. And in talking to them, you're going to see, oh, okay, they're very different people, even though on the outside they're doing the same things and actually might appear very similar. But at their core, they have a different desire. And I think that's what kind of pushes people into certain categories or certain groups versus just kind of like whether someone is more talkative or whether someone's more organized. I think those are important, but I think there's a deeper meaning to what we do.
Right. Right. So what is the challenge with some of these profiling programs? For instance, I'm familiar with one. As I moved over to Utah, there was one that was so popular, and I don't even remember the name of it, but I know it was just yellow. It was red, yellow, blue, and white, and
Mm.
those were the colors. And I looked at them. I go, okay, the red's pretty close, the yellow's pretty close, the green's pretty close, but the white doesn't even come close to anybody. So what is the challenge that you have found, and why did you end up developing your own?
Well, one of the challenges, I mean, will say that I laughed because there were four specific colors, right, that you gave. And I write about that in the book. My system also uses kind of a set of four. And then it has like four personality types within that four, making 16 different personality types, right? But I write about, like, there's a whole chapter based on the fact that archetypally, whether it was Plato or Aristotle or, Hippocrates, we have a tendency to split things up into four, right? And with to different designations within those four groupings. But I saw that pattern of four, kind of like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. When you think of things like, and
Right.
each one fits a certain kind of category. I think one of the difficulties I found though is that, like you were finding with the colors, they do tend to focus. It's the methodology and the diagnostic process, right? I feel like that's the thing. Like you can, if the diagnostic problem or diagnostic methodology is wrong or flawed, then it doesn't really matter the prescriptive measures, right? And I feel like a lot of these books have prescriptive measures and that, like, let's say 99% of the book are these prescriptions, and the 1% that they have in the beginning is like a test that you take, right? You take, like, I don't
Right.
know, 50 question test, and then then you read about yourself, right? But what if the questions are wrong? So the way I wrote the book and why I came up with my methodology was, in a way, I was trying to teach people how to be the test, because I feel like that diagnostic part is way more important than the prescriptive part, even though the prescriptive part is where everyone wants to get to, right? They're like, no, don't tell me how to do it. Tell me what I am so I can figure out what I'm going to do with it. I'm like, well, let's take some time to figure out why we are why we are the way we are. And that might be more helpful.
Yeah, and and as you mentioned earlier, there's so much that gets involved in that because as you look at these personality types, and as you say, literally 16, not 4, 16, because you have the crossovers, but also
Mhm.
you get into the values, you get into the purposes, you get into all of those things that can literally change an individual. So to try to pinpoint them into one specific one of 4 different personality types can become very dangerous because that's not who
Mhm.
they really are.
Right. And the benefit of doing so, the four within the four is that, at least the very least, if you're within, I call them packs, right? Because my methodology uses animal personality types just because it's very easy to remember.
Okay.
Like, right, if you call someone a fox, I think we all know what the fox is like, right? I mean, even in,
Uh,
like, archetypally in movies and shows, we know who acts like a fox. Um, but if you're within this particular pack, then you are going to be similar to people within that pack because you're going to have the same core value. But how you go about achieving that value is going to differ based on the various personalities within that pack. And I think I started to find that out working with students, right? Where you're like, oh, yeah, these students are similar to each other, but they're different in a certain way. And that difference makes all the difference in terms of how to best utilize their skills and strengths, right?
well, and I find I'm fascinated about the fact that you work with students and so forth. And I think that there's some real keys there that most teachers really do not apply, understand, or any of that. But
Mhm.
have you found that based on looking at the personalities of the kids that you've worked with, which all seem to have some very specific issues, did you find that they fit into a specific personality profiling, or were they all over the board?
You know, it was it's interesting because, me personally, I work with a set amount of students, right? But as a company, we worked with like 1,000 a year, right? So in that
Right.
1,000, it generally fit a certain percentage, like where there'd be half the students are going to be like this, and then a third are going to be like this, and then you have certain minority packs that will act a certain way. I noticed, like, individually, I hate to say this, but I probably work best and I'm most effective with specific personalities, generally based on my own personality, right? I have
Exactly.
like, yeah, like, it's generally the personalities where I'm within that pack. So students who so I'll just say that I call them the shamans, and they tend to be seekers of self-knowledge, right? Which can be pretty difficult as a kid, because if you seek your own self-knowledge but are constantly being told this is what you should do your homework, be responsible, be organized, and that might not necessarily fit you, that can cause a lot of internal struggle. And I think growing up, I also shared that internal struggle. So working with students like that was a lot easier for me, right? Because I can go like, no, I know how you're feeling, but I'm a more confident version of themselves, right? I should be. I'm older and supposedly wiser. And so I do tend to work better with those students. But I would say that knowing about the personalities, I will change up based on what I know. So I know certain other personalities work better with maybe I don't want to say the whip approach, but certain personalities work better if you're harder on them, because they don't take offense. They're not super sensitive. They will try to get away with whatever they can get away with. So for them, you got to be hard on them because they'll just adjust, right? They're like, okay, he's not letting me get away with this, so I won't do that. But he's letting me get away with this, so I will do that. And it just depends from kid to kid, right?
And so the other thing that comes to my mind is we've got the personalities, but we also have the learning style. And the reason I'm
Mhm.
bringing this up because I know there's going to be some parents listening to this. And one of the things that I really believe is most of the time within our educational system in the United States, they only teach to one learning style. And that's why you
Mhm.
have so many students that struggle and then get medicated because the teachers and everybody else doesn't understand that, you know what, it's not the kid, it's the teacher and the style that they're teaching.
Right. One of my favorite quotes actually is from Baldwin, where I'm paraphrasing, where he says the irony of education is the more we become educated, the more we start to question the system that we were educated in. Right. And I feel like as it pertains to the personality typing methodology, it's like I have four packs, and one of those packs makes about half the population. And guess what? That's the type of population that also tends to become teachers, and specifically elementary and grade school teachers. And when you think about it, like they prioritize safety and security, right? So they're telling kids, okay, this is how you learn. You learn by the safe, cautious approach. Like write down your homework assignment every day. Make sure you have everything planned out. Make sure you have a set structure. There's a certain way to do things. How do we know that it works? Because it was done 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and we're just going to keep doing that because it's proven to be correct. And you should do that too because that's the safe approach. And I do think it works with half the population. Like a kindergarten class, half the kids, anyone who's taught kindergarten knows half the kids will like listen to the rules as you tell them. But then you have about a third of the class that's just running around and grabbing things and throwing things around. And I think that third, it's very easy to see that that particular style of teaching in our education system doesn't work specifically for them.
All right, let's talk about your methodology so that we can get more into specifics on this. So what is your methodology and how do you identify the different personalities?
So the simplest way I can say it is there's four packs, and within each pack they have one core value. And yes, we can all value everything, but it's really what we prioritize, right? So the gatherers, they're the largest pack, and they make about half the population that I found, and they prioritize safety and security. So when you think of like the way our society is structured, I mean, the gatherers are the backbone of society. They're organized, they're structured, they're detailed, they're responsible, they're dutiful, they follow the rules, do what they're told, and enforce the rules and maintain order. There's a third of the population that are called the hunters. And like any good hunter, they explore, they are really good with tools, they're very physical. They tend to learn as students, they tend to learn based on visceral, like grabbing things and moving things around and like kind of like seeing what works and what doesn't, because their core value is excitement, like visceral excitement. They're the type who wants to go on a roller coaster because they feel like going on the roller coaster is going to make them feel like they're going to die. And that's exciting to them, right? The risk. Whereas you talk to Gather, and the Gather's like, why would you ever want to feel like you're going to die? That's the last thing I want to feel like. And if you notice, that's already a conflict right there,
Right.
right? That's the typical Bert Ernie kind of conflict where you got like the organized, structured, responsible person versus the spontaneous, flexible, way of the world kind of person. Um, and then you have the two minority packs that make up maybe 8% of the population each. And one is the shaman pack, which I had mentioned before, and they focus on self-knowledge. And then the other pack, which is also 8%, I call them the Smiths, and they focus on information. So, you can see they're very different value systems that each one has. And as we're working, or at least when I was working with kids, I could see that each one is going to respond to stimuli differently. And so the key is not trying to make them adjust to, the teacher's response, but to adjust to what they need, right?
Do you find that those those sections that you talk about, the animals, do you find, or the groups, do you find that they kind of correlate with some of the more well-known personality systems when you talk about, the red, the yellow, the blue, the green type of thing? Do they fit into that profiling?
They tend to, like, when I look at whenever I see anything with fours, that's like my, the sirens go up. I'm like, oh, I wonder how it's going to fit. And you can kind of like archetypally see, oh yeah, these seem to be like the gatherers and these seem to be like the Smiths. And it tends to, like, I think I'm in agreement with a lot of the results of where personality types or like those structures tend to go. My methodology differs in how to get there. Like, how do you, because I've often find that people mistype themselves when they take tests and they hate that. Like, someone will say, oh, I'm like, the most popular one is the MBTI, right? So someone will say, I'm an INFP. And then I'll be like, oh, no, you're not that. And then they get mad. They're like, wait, you're trying to tell me what I am? I'm like, well, I mean, I don't think you are. And then I explain, and they're like, oh, well, and I just ask them one simple question, like, were you a good student? And then based on the response, I'm like, yeah, see, your response is telling me INFPs don't say that. and then and then they start seeing patterns, and oftentimes they will agree when I say that they're mistyped and I retype them. But really, it's more or less how, like, we don't often know ourselves, right? Because we're not often comparing ourselves to other people. We
Right.
just see ourselves, right? So I think that's what I'm there for. We're going to say, like, look, no, in comparison to this person, you're very different.
Okay, so you're using letters right now to identify what is that personality profile? Which particular one is that called?
Oh, I'm sorry. So I said INFP because that's the MBTI version and that's what people know. But in the INFP for me is called the humpback whale. And the way I describe it is, the humpback whale is the daydreamer. They're like at their worst, they're a martyr. They're the sacrificial lamb. They're very like, they're the Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter type. They tend to be very self-sacrificing and they take a lot of things upon themselves. They're the person who is very spiritual. They tend to be connected with nature and all those kinds of things. So like for me, it's more of a holistic approach where I just based on patterns of behavior that I've seen. And since, we used to have 1,000 kids a year, so, over a decade of owning that education company, that's a lot of people that we type. And that's including the parents too. I'd often have my tutors try to type the parents and give information back. So at the very least, I could take the information that my tutors collected and I could help them try to type the parents. And that way they can kind of see the conflict between parent and student, right?
Yeah, and some of the well-known um, people out there that are really promoting a lot of this self-development and so forth use the DISC test, the
Mm.
DISC. Tony Robbins does, and there's some others that I won't name, and they actually don't call it that, but the reality is that's what it is. Um, what are your thoughts on that one? Because that's the one I'm familiar with in a certain way. So, how do you compare what you're talking about to that? Are you familiar with that one?
I am. And it's interesting because that also has like a four-letter dichotomy, right? And it's either this
Yes,
or that, right? And
right,
I feel like we're all like everyone's kind of on the same page, and we sometimes differ just on how we get there, right? What's the approach, and how do we diagnose like
right.
the issue, like is it this or that, or extroverted or introverted? And I do like that. I think it's more probably externally based than necessarily internally based. My approach tends to be more, and that's a lot more guessing, I guess. You have to try to guess what's inside someone versus what you see on the outside. So I get like why they're more appealing because they're much more observational, and I think we can observe behavior and then try to interpret that behavior how we
Uh-huh.
will. But
And the one that I use actually uses that disk, but it brings in it does the same thing you do. So it brings in the fact that there's 16 personalities, number one,
mm,
and number two, it does the very same thing you're doing, which is getting into the values, getting into all of those type of things. So, and that's okay. So let's get back into what you're doing and what you're talking about. You talked a little bit about and I did too, and I brought it up. You have your extroverts, your introverts, your right brain, your left brain. How
mhm.
does yours fit into that, or do you kind of deny all of that and go a different direction?
Oh, I definitely wouldn't deny that. Obviously, extroversion and introversion have been around for quite a long time. I mean, young, like quite a long time, meaning like 100, right? 100 years, 120 years, maybe. I do think that, and in the book I write about that, I do think extroversion, introversion got very popular because I think that dichotomy works really well with a certain pack. So gatherers make up about half the population, right? And they're also the most likely to volunteer for studies because they're all about doing their civic duty and they're community minded. So they're definitely like, oh yeah, I want to help people. Yeah, study me, you know? And so I do think their value system and the way they respond to things definitely gets permeated throughout society more than other types. And I think with gatherers, that idea of gaining energy from being around a lot of people versus gaining energy from being by yourself is actually pretty applicable. But I do think that there are other types that does not necessarily apply. And one I always say is like the Smiths. Smiths tend to focus on information, right? So with those, that's like to separate an extroverted version versus an introverted version of a Smith, it doesn't really have to do what we normally think of as extroversion and introversion, where they get their energy from. It's more so how do they process information? Because
Hmm.
once again, the Smiths seek information. So I have two specific types that I always mention in this example, the chimpanzee and the owl. They're both Smiths. They both seek information, one is extroverted and one is introverted, and yet the difference between them is that the extroverted Smith or the chimpanzee processes information by experimentation. They experiment on things or on people, and they build models, and then they see whether that model works or not. And if it doesn't, then they change it up. Whether the owl is more theoretical. They think about like, oh, like everything's calculated in their mind. They're much more observant. And I think those two things are very different than how we might define extroversion and introversion. Sorry, that was a really wonky explanation.
Okay, and
But
how would you put them as far as right brain, left brain?
ooh, right brain, left brain. That's an interesting right brain, left brain. It's tricky, right? Because they always say that Einstein, what made him so brilliant was that his, what is that, the corpus callosum was larger. That was the only thing that was different about his brain. I think his brain was only slightly bigger than the average brain, but they said his corpus callosum was enlarged, and that's the one that bridges the gap between the two.
Yes.
And I don't haven't done many studies on left brain, right brain, aside from knowing that the genius of Einstein was that he was able to bridge the gap between what we think of, right?
Right. All right. And so as you talk about that, you talk about the monkey, you talk about the owl, where would you put them? Extrovert, introvert, right brain, left brain?
So the owl would technically be introverted, and the chimpanzee would be extroverted. But the I like to use a lot of pop culture because people know it. So the difference I give is Tony Stark or Iron Man is a chimpanzee. Bruce Banner, who plays, who it turns out to be the Incredible Hulk, he would be an owl. And if anyone who's ever seen those movies and those shows knows that those two get along very, very well. They speak the same language. They know they obviously they're science based, right? They're both scientists. And you see Tony Stark and you see he's talkative, but I don't think he would like fit into the normal description of extroversion because at the end of the day, he doesn't want to be around people. Where does he want to be most of all? He wants to be in his lab by himself, experimenting and building things. And I think that's how I differ from the normal approach is that, yeah, like I think focusing on where values take us and what pack they put us in, then that's what determines really what we are. Because it's all contextual, right? Because I've had a lot of people say, well, I'm extroverted in this situation, but I'm introverted in this situation. I'm like, yeah, because really where we put our energy is based on our values, and that's all context, right?
So here's another question for you, and I don't know if you get into this because as I look at it, and as I originally started learning about this, one of the key factors that I found so valuable was that there were literally three personality types, and it's not to do with the what we've been talking about, but it has to do with that innate personality, the personality that we think we need to be, which would be the social personality, and then the conscious personality, who we really choose to be. Do you get into that at all?
I do in terms, I like that idea because I do in terms of like how people grow, right? Because people are always asking me, can we change? Like, can our personality type change? And I'm like, well, I don't think we change. I think we grow and we
Yes.
either grow into better versions of ourselves or worse versions of ourselves. And I think if we grow and we get further away from that core value of who we truly identify with, and we start changing based on what you said, like what people are telling us what we should be, I think there's a danger to that. And I think the closer we grow into our true self and understanding ourselves, it will grow into a healthier version of ourselves. So in that regard, I do like the idea of like that we act certain ways in different situations. And generally it's because of like our growth path.
Yes, and I know that I talk a lot with people that I interview about the imposter syndrome, and
Mhm.
I look at that from the perspective, at least with my definition, that you've got people that behave in a certain way in a social situation because they are affected that this is how I have to be, this is how I have to be. Now you take that and then you take someone who really has the confidence to be who they really are, and they walk into a social situation and they say, you know what, this is how I need to respond to these people because of who they are. And they consciously do that rather than do it because they happen to be in that victim mode. What are your thoughts on that?
It's funny. I also work a lot with students who are working on their college essays, strangely enough. And I love it because when you work on your college essays, that's a great opportunity for me to coach them life lessons, right? Because the college essays are always asking, like, who are you? What do you love to do? And I'm going to relate it back, but every student, or not every student, but most students who I work with, their first instinct is like, what do they want to hear? What does the reader want to hear? What should I be to them? What do I need to be? And I'm always like, no, no, tell me, what do you love? What do you really love? And they're always so afraid because they're like, no, no, I have to appear this way. I have to be say I'm responsible and industrious and blah blah blah. I'm like, do you think they really want to hear that? You think they're going to believe you? They read like thousands or hundreds of thousands of these things a year, right? Like just be yourself. Have the confidence to be yourself, be truthful, like show that you're passionate and don't worry about what they think. And ideally the students will listen, but it's after much like of me like not forcing that, but like preaching it to them. And I feel the same way is true with personality, right? I think we're so focused on like what people want that we start to forget what we want. And I think that's just one thing is more effective. I think if you just be who you are, I think people are going to love that. And two, it's better for your happiness, right?
Oh,
Overall, like,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. So, before we started, we were joking a little bit. What is your personality type?
My personality type.
Yeah.
I'm a baboon. I'm a baboon, and I know I'm just saying random animals, and people are like, "Oh." I also say like baboon is not a very appealing animal. So anyone who gets an animal they don't like, I'm like, hey, my animal is not appealing, right? Like baboons are known for flashing their butts at people. Okay, I don't do that. But a baboon is a part of the shaman pack. So shamans seek self-knowledge. Baboons they seek self-knowledge in a way where they're a little bit more aggressive at seeking it. And then once they find something they really believe in, then they're a little bit preachy and they tend to preach and voice their opinions very actively. And that is kind of what I do. And of course, we have a lot of our weaknesses as well. But yeah, I'm a baboon. And, my role, I feel like in life is to be a voice to like certain ideas that I like.
So definitely extrovertish, obviously. Uh,
Yeah.
Definitely extrovertish and kind of a combination of left brain, right brain, would you say?
I probably yeah, because I mean we're very abstract baboons, and it's a good example too of when you say extroversion because a peacock would be another example of like it's of an extroverted personality type, but they're part of the hunters, and hunters seek excitement, right? So what would be fun for a peacock being extroverted is very different than what would be fun for a baboon's version of extroversion, right? Like a baboon can go up and be a preacher and preach or like give a TED talk on like recycling or something that they really feel passionate about. That's a different type of extroversion than the peacock's version, which is doing body shots in Cabo on the on the deck of a bar.
Right.
That's their version, and both we wouldn't be able to switch places. I'm not going to do body shots, and they're probably not going to want to do a TED talk, right? And that's the difference between us.
Okay. And you said you're going to tell me what type I am after we've had a chance to talk.
Yeah, I mean, okay, yeah, I said I would guess.
Yes,
It's
you're
been
going to guess.
it's harder. It's harder now. Like I said dolphin in the beginning because I do know like you focus on people learning and being educated and like about themselves. Um, but you also are pretty analytical and that kind of ranges towards the Smith to me. But yeah, I'm just gonna go with dolphin, which would be an ENFJ. I don't know if you're familiar with your MBTI type.
I'm not familiar with that. I'm more familiar with disc. So,
Oh, okay. Oh, I don't know what your disc type would be, to be honest. But yeah, you'd have to take my test and figure out what animal you are, and then I could guess, and then
and then you could
hopefully,
guess.
yeah.
Well,
But
and it's interesting. If we get into extroversion and introversion, innately, I'm an introvert.
hmm,
And innately, if we get into the right brain, left brain, I am a left brain introvert. That's why I went into dentistry. Very focused on the small things and that type of thing, very detail oriented, that type. But also, I'm an extrovert. So if you were to look at my disc, I'm a D I. In other words, I'm a D, so I'm up there in the red, and then I'm down there in the green. And
hmm.
but an extrovert, and here's the interesting thing. Would you say that I'm an extrovert? No, because here, we're talking, I can give you my opinions and so forth, but put me in a room where I don't know anybody. I'm not out there talking to people. I'm kind of just sitting back and not doing anything. Get me into a room or into a situation like us where we're talking about things that are fascinating to both of us, and I'll talk as much as you do.
That's just a perfect example of why, yeah, I don't. That's a perfect example of why I don't always love the extroversion versus introversion dichotomy, right? Because you're
Exactly.
both
Yeah.
based on, and you're ener so that's the fact that you're energized with ideas that definitely is something that shamans and smiths would have. Like that's the thing where because they're abstract in nature. So they get excited when they talk about either their feelings or their ideas. And that's when they blossom, right? But most of life is tends to be more external, like the conversations like, oh, what did you do yesterday? Oh, how did you like Bali? And then people start talking about the restaurants they went to, and that excites a large percentage of people, but it might not necessarily get a um, a smith or a shaman out of their shell. But once you start talking about ideas, and they're like, oh no, let me express myself a little more in this situation. Um, but you did say you were red, so I mean, I would guess a smith, maybe a killer whale. Have you ever seen Game of Thrones?
No, no, I
Oh,
haven't.
darn. I love to use fictional, but like I would guess like a killer whale or a spider. Killer whales or maybe a chimpanzee. I know I'm saying like three things. That's like not necessarily fair, but I would guess a smith. Smiths love information. They love sharing ideas. They love to bounce ideas off of each other. The only difference between a chimpanzee and a killer whale is a killer whale is more of a CEO type. They're very dominant,
Uh-oh.
domineering, and kind of like, "No, let's do this." Where a chimpanzee is more experimental. They're kind of like fun. They like to play practical jokes on people. They like to figure out what people are by kind of like prodding them and poking them, like intellectually, of course, not physically. But that would be my guess.
All right, so let's talk about relationships. And
Hmm.
let's talk about the importance of understanding not only our own, but also our friends, individuals, wife, partner, whatever that happens to be, children. How do we determine and understand not only how we communicate, but also how they want to be communicated to, so that if necessary, we can change that. And I experienced that as a father of four. I
Hmm.
finally, as I studied this to the point where I finally sat down with my kids and said, "Look, guys, I'm I will offer my opinion instantaneously, and I need you from now on to say, Dad, I either, do you want my opinion or do you want me to listen?" And shut up, and that's made a big difference. And they still laugh about it, but it's still very valuable. So as you talk about your personality profiling and so forth, what's the importance of understanding both our own and the other people who are within that realm of true relationships?
I mean, like you said right there, like I think depending on our values, we're gonna take things differently, right? Like a story I can tell from my own life. I'm a shaman. Self-knowledge is a big thing for me. It's like understand, like ethics, like understand. I mean, in my mind, there's like a right way to do things, and I just want to feel like that I'm being heard and that I'll stand on principle. So a little story of my father. I forgot it was. I was really young and I was arguing with my mom because it's probably something really dumb. Like I wanted to wear a type of shoe to a party and she said it was inappropriate. My mother's a gatherer. Gatherers are very focused on what is appropriate and what is inappropriate, right? And I get that. I'm not like criticizing it, but as a kid, I was just like, no, that doesn't even make sense, blah, blah, blah. And my dad, who's a smith, so I'm showing three different animal types and three different packs here. He's a chimpanzee, so we're very similar in a lot of ways. So we're talking, and I'm like, "Yeah, like, mom says it's dumb. Like she's not letting me wear the shoes that I want to wear, and that's stupid. It doesn't even make sense." And he's like, "Eric, you're totally right. It makes absolutely no logical sense. But does it really matter? Just say that, just do it because it's just going to be easier on both our lives. You just do it, right? Just do it, and make her happy." And I was like, okay, I will do that because as long as you agree with me, it's funny because I didn't necessarily care about the actual thing, right? I was like, okay, I'll wear the shoes that she told me. It was more the principle of the thing. And he knew that and he was being much more pragmatic about it. And I was like, okay, as long as you understand that you agree with me and you know that I'm right too, I will totally do that because it had, and I think knowing how your kids are can really show you how to, I won't say manipulate them, but connect with them in a way where you're giving them what they need. And my dad knew exactly what I needed in that moment was to just know that I was right, where other personality types might not want that. They actually might want to wear those shoes, right? And you might have to treat them a little differently, right? But I think that's a good example.
So in your book, do you get into that part of it of how we can begin to understand how to communicate with someone because that's how they need to be communicated with versus how we may choose to communicate based on our own personality?
Yeah, the book is very specific in terms of each individual animal personality type. Like it'll break it down and go, okay, this is the difference between this one and this one. And and it just goes down the methodology. And as you're reading it, you'll start ideally, I use a lot of examples and personal anecdotes, student anecdotes, fictional anecdotes to like kind of so that people can start seeing, oh, this is the difference between this type and this type. So clearly, if this type values this and this type values this, you're going to have to, and you're this one, you got to like be able to like adjust to this one, right? Yeah, so it's pretty specific within each animal type.
So interestingly, as I said, I've done this podcast for years, and one of the fascinating things I've experienced is interviewing a lot of ladies, particularly, who have experienced abuse and
Mm.
who have been involved in codependent relationships. And what I have found is the personality value, the behavioral evaluation I use, I found that they fit very often into a very specific modality. Do you find the same thing, particularly with people who have different experiences and challenges, that they fit into a specific personality type?
Yeah, depending on the challenge, it generally like every personality type has its flaws, right? Like, and and
Yes.
generally our strengths are based on those flaws. And for that specific one, where abuse, especially in a domestic situation, it tends to fit. Not to pick on them, but the gatherers have a tendency. Gatherers trust authority, trust society, trust social traditions, and in instances like that, obviously let's face it, historically, women have been in a much more subservient role traditionally.
Yes.
So when you do value traditional values such as that, and if a woman has that particular personality that tends to be more deferential, then they might find themselves in that situation. That personality will find that in that situation quite a bit. In fact, like I think the personality that I have is called the bear. That's the example. They're the bear. They're so loving. They're so loyal. They're so kind. Of course, their flaw is they can be overly loyal.
Yeah.
And obviously, they're the most likely, like if you're a woman in a domestic situation, to let their significant other abuse them and just say, oh, well, but he really loves me, and that's once again consistent with their type. Now, all the other types have different flaws and will find themselves in different problem situations. But that would be a good example of like the bear.
Well, and I love how you talk about the fact that those very strengths that we can determine based on that, if they go too far, can become weaknesses. You talk about, the red or the D, who is very strong, so forth. You know, if they don't check that, all of a sudden they become overbearing and unkind and all of those type of things. And so, do you talk about that in the book about how those strengths of our personality can become weaknesses if we don't recognize that and control it?
Yes, there's actually a chapter called the deviant roles. And of course, it's kind of said humorously because I want to look, I try to look at everything in a humorous light to make it a little
Right.
bit easier to digest. And each animal personality type has a flip side, which would be basically when they've gone wrong, right? Because for every, like, let's say a stag is your typical gatherer. They're very organized, structured, confident, strong. My mom was a stag. They are the school principal type. They are like the person who's been told their whole life that their values are right and they should share that and, maintain that order for everybody. That can lend itself to some problems, if you're not all there. And so their deviant role, I call it the fascist. Because you can imagine like that would, if you have that mentality, it can be very good in a lot of ways, but it can lead maybe to fascism versus other types that maybe be overconsumptive, that might just like be too laid back and just go with the flow. And their deviant role is called the tortured artist, right? Because they just might like just consume way too much. So I do have like every role for every personality type at their worst.
So, how do people find your book and how do people find you? Is particularly, I would assume, parents who really have a special concern about their children's learning could find your company. How do people find both?
Ooh, I got to remember my own websites. You can find me at projectutopia.com, and that's Utopia YOU because I think you can find utopia within yourself, right? And it's clever because it's spelled like YouTube. So projectutopia.com is my personal website where you can find my bio and stuff about my life coaching. And my book you can find anywhere. What do they say? Anywhere you purchase books. If you want to give Jeff Bezos your money, find it on Amazon. But if you don't, Barnes and Noble is a great way to purchase it, or your local bookstore. Just order it from there.
Great. And is it on Audible also?
Unfortunately, it is not on Audible. I've been asking my agent about that and saying, hey, like, can we put this on Audible? And apparently, I need to get the rights from my publisher to do it. So ideally, I'll put it on Audible within the next year or so.
I
And
hope
personally,
so.
I'll get, well, okay.
I love Audible.
Oh, I've heard that request quite a bit.
So, as we close, what would be that message that you'd really like to share with the audience?
I would say find your anchor first. Find who you are, find what you want, because that anchor is going to keep you away from the storm of other, or at least keep you settled when the storm of other people's values and personalities come calling. And then once you have that anchor, then you kind of explore your own flaws and your own weaknesses through other people. But find it first, otherwise you'll lose yourself.
Okay, and I think that's so important, and I appreciate what you're saying there. I think that to understand and to be aware of who we really are, and that goes into all sorts of issues, but to
Mhm.
be able to do that and then take that and move forward with that, I think is so powerful. So, what a blessing you are to the
Well, thank you.
population out there that you've written the book, that you've gotten into this area, which a lot of people don't get into to the depth that you do, and particularly where you've included values and all of those type of things in relationship to quote personality, I think is so accurate for people.
Well, thank you so much. Those are kind words, and hopefully it'll make people laugh as well.
Well, hopefully. And folks, go get that book. I guarantee you it will make a difference in your lives. And this is Dr. Doug. Thanks for listening. Hope you'll listen some more as we come into more type of podcasts. This is Dr. Doug saying namaste.